Hey everybody, welcome back to Pizza Legends Battles. Our end goal for this video is to create an actual UI that hero-controlled pizzas can use to play the battle sequences. So we're going to show a list of moves that the active pizza knows how to use and allow you to click each one or use the arrow keys to navigate to which one you want to submit. To do this, we're going to create a menu system that is reusable so that when we make more menus in the future of this game, we can just use the same system instead of having to redo it from scratch. The starting code for this video is linked below, as is the whole playlist if you've missed anything. Let's get started. So because we're working on the submission menu today, the first thing we want to do is make sure that the game always boots up with one of those menus present. That way we don't have to sit through the intro message every single time. So I'm going to go to battle.js. Nope, I'm going to go to turncycle.js and come down to the init method here where we have this initial text message. Let's just take that out. That way when the turn cycle starts, we get our first turn and then we'll start right off the bat with a submission menu. Let's open up our submission menu and see. Remember, we left it like this, where right off the bat, every time it initializes, it just immediately does this computer AI decision. So today we're going to fork it and allow player-controlled combatants to make their own decision. So let's pop over to battle.js and take our first player-controlled combatant and add a flag just like we did for the hero in the overworld. It's going to be called isPlayerControlled true. And now back in submission menu, in our init, when we see that that caster is player-controlled, then we can show some UI. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do the same decide that we've been doing. We'll make a new method here that's like show menu, and that's going to create and inject some DOM. So we'll go ahead and pass through that container. And down here, we can say this.show menu, passing in the container. And now we're going to set up a whole little system for the menu that we're going to show. But the first thing we need is to decide on some options that we want to show the player. This particular component we're working on is going to have different pages of options it can show. And so I'm going to make a new method here called getPages. So our first example of a page is like the root page, the first page you see. It's going to have a list of items. Another example will be like the attacks page. So maybe you choose attacks from the home root menu, and then you'll see these options. Now each option in the pages here are going to follow a little bit of a format that we're going to set up a system for. And each option is going to contain a label, which is what the buttons should say, a description, which is like the hint text of what the button's going to do, and then a handler. So when we choose this option, what do we want to do? And it's just a JavaScript function. Now let's quickly fill out the other root options we're going to have. So we said we're going to have an items option. The description for that can be like, choose an item from your inventory. Actually, we'll just leave it short. And the handler. And then I'll go ahead and quickly bring in our third option, which we're not going to cover today, but we'll come back to it later. And that's the swapping pizza option. So if you want to change out to a different pizza in your lineup, you can choose this third one, and then you'll see a list of valid options you have to swap in. Now let's start getting these buttons on the screen. And I'll just wire up some go to attacks page, just like console log, so we can see that this handler is working when we choose the attack option. Now the real star of the show in today's video is going to be this component that we're going to work on, and that's going to be called a keyboard menu. This component is going to power not only the battle menus here, but also the rest of the menus for the entire game. So we're talking title screen, the pause menu, the shopping menu, like when you go to the store and buy pizza supplies. It might seem like we're overly extracting this today in this video, but this is really going to pay off as we continue to build out the game. So in this method here, I'll go ahead and write some code that's like this.keyboard menu is going to be a new keyboard menu, which this doesn't exist yet. We're going to do that next. And then we'll go ahead and init it, passing in the container we want to inject the UI to. And then we need to populate this keyboard menu with the first page of options. And so to do that, we're going to create a method on this component called setOptions. And then we want to pass in our first page, which for us is going to be this.getPages.root to populate the keyboard menu with just these three options here. Here I am in index.html. We want to go ahead and create a new JavaScript file for our keyboard menu. And I'm just going to do it in the root of the project here. We'll come back and organize this stuff when we come back and organize everything else. And I'll make a new class in here called keyboard menu. It's going to take a constructor. In the constructor here, I'm going to bring in some code that tracks some of the state we're going to need. For one, we're going to have a list of options, and this is always going to be set by that updater method, the one that we're using in here, set options. We're going to have key bindings for our up and down arrow directions. We're going to be able to reuse the same key press listener that we created before. And finally, we're going to have a lot of button elements in this component here, and we want to always track which one was previously focused. Sometimes the actual browser might lose focus on one of our buttons here, but we always want this component to always kind of know which one was focused before, so we can easily snap back to it. So let's tackle this set options updater now. So we'll make a new method called set options, and it's going to take in an array of those option objects that we saw before. We'll set this.options to whatever was passed in. And now we want to iterate through each option and create an actual button tag. We're going to need an element to put these buttons in. And so we're going to go ahead and create one of our create element methods here. And this is just going to define an element, new div. It's going to have a class keyboard menu. Again, as usual, matching up with our class name here. And then when we init to a container, we're going to run create element. And now we have something we can add elements to. So we'll come back up here. We'll set the inner HTML. We want to keep track of the option config here and then also the index that we're on now. We're going to be able to use the index to set some data attributes that help us know which one was actually clicked. I'll just return a string of HTML here. And then when we're done with this loop, we want to go ahead and join all of the strings that we're creating here together, so that we'll be left with just one blob of HTML. So in here, we're gonna have a div. Okay, so in our option container here, I'm gonna add a button tag, make sure it's closed. The text of the button is going to be our options label. Give us some more space here. Then I'm gonna fill in two data attributes on the button itself. The first is just gonna be button, data button, kind of lame name. But this is just going to be the index of which button we're on in the loop. We're going to be adding an event listener that's going to look at that index and kind of figure out which one we clicked on or which one we focused on. And then we'll do data description. Just like we have the options label here, we're going to store the options description on the button. And a reminder that these labels and descriptions come from our option config object, which looks like this, like attack, choose an attack, items, choose an item. Next, we're going to add a spot for another piece of data, and that's going to be stuff that we want to appear on the right side of the option. So when we start talking about items and stuff like that, we might want to show the quantity of each item row that we're displaying as an option. When we're talking shopping or something, we may want to show the price in line with the option. If the option itself defines a right function, and that would look like this. Then this bit of content, whatever is returned from the right function, will show up in that span tag. Again, we'll come back to that when we're doing quantities and stuff, but for now we can just leave it off. Another feature we're going to include with these option configs is the ability to disable an option. So under description and items, for example, I'll say disabled true. And if this is seen, then we want to go ahead and disable the button tag. So let's come back into keyboard menu here. And then in the map function here, I'm going to create a new variable called disabled attribute. And that's either going to be the string disabled or just an empty string. And then we can plot that right here in with the button tag. So we'll just include it in the string like this. So if the button should be disabled, it'll have the disabled attribute on it. Now let's go ahead and get this on the screen so we can at least see what it looks like. It's going to be terribly unstyled so far, but that's okay. Right after we create the element here, let's go ahead and say container.append child this.element. And if you remember from the previous file, our kind of order of operations here that we're creating it and then we're initializing it. So this will inject the element into the DOM. And so once set options runs, then the buttons will be populated and ready to go. Quick update on the right part here. It should be option.write, not o.write. That was a goof for my notes. And same as disabled up here. Make sure it's option.disabled. Let's include this new file on the page. So I'll come down with our other files. We called it keyboard menu. And now we can load up the game. So now we see our buttons in the DOM, and if I inspect them, we can see they've got all the values on them, like the iterator, the description, the right section here. They don't really do anything yet, and they certainly don't look good. So let's go ahead and style them up now and then add those bindings. I want to come over to our styles directory here and then create a new file. This will be called keyboardmenu.css. We'll bring in some styles here and talk through them. So the first thing we're going to do is take the keyboard menu itself and give it some of our branding, border, and background colors. And then we'll always make sure it's position absolute Each usage of the keyboard menu is going to be responsible for sort of positioning it where it should go on screen in that context. So later we'll be adding like battle keyboard menu should be over here. Later on in the game, pause menu might be more of in the center of the screen. You can kind of put them wherever you want. Now here in the button styles, we have a lot of resetting rules and then also some display rules that we'll talk more about in future videos when we flesh out the buttons a little bit more. The most important part is this focus bit at the bottom, where the focus button, we want to make sure it has a really clear appearance that it's focused. And for that, we're going to use a background color. Next, we'll bring in some rules for the option container itself. And so each option should be position relative, pretty simple. And then that right section is going to hug the right side of the option. Back in index.html here, I'm going to include that new style sheet on the page. So it's going to be keyboard menu.css. And now our menu should look a little bit better. So back in the game, we're starting to get somewhere, but we definitely need to position this where it goes and stretch it out a bit. You can see that when I hit the tab key to focus on an option, we get that nice blue selected background color. Back in keyboard menu CSS here, I'm going to go ahead and add in some battle specific keyboard menu styles. So if we're in the battle container, our keyboard menu component should hug the bottom right like this, and then stretch out to be 140 pixels wide. And now we can see it's starting to come together. I'm going to go ahead and add some padding. Next, let's add that bottom description bar that sits on the bottom of the screen and tells us more information about which option we have selected. Back in keyboard menu JS here, I'm going to find our section where we're creating an element and then add another element as well. And so this is going to be the description box element. It's going to be a div with the same class description box. It's going to have just a paragraph inside it. And then we're also going to save a reference to that paragraph because we're going to be updating it a lot. Whenever your focus changes on which option we want to show the info for, we're going to need to select that paragraph and update the text. And so by saving a reference here, it's just going to speed things up a little bit. In our init method here, we can go ahead and add this element to the DOM. We can add some initial text here just to see it working. Beautiful. And now for the styles, we can come into keyboard menu. Right before the battle specific stuff, I'll bring in some styles here. We're going to take that description box, put it on the bottom of the screen, give our branding colors to it, and then just some padding for some cush. And then the paragraph itself will play with the font size and then reset any margin on there. Let's see this working. Now when I reload, you can see our layouts coming together. Our description box is down here. And now what we want to do is add the bindings to make these both arrow controlled and to wire these two pieces together so that a tax description shows up here when it's selected. So let's come up to the loop that we're creating all these buttons. And right after we create the buttons, we're going to start adding listeners to them. So I'll say this.element.query selector all to get all those buttons. For each button, first we're going to add the obvious one, the click. So add event listener, click. We want to figure out which of our option configs was actually chosen, and we can pull that by looking at the data button attribute. Ultimately, we want to get a reference back to the callback that we're trying to fire, and the callback would be like the handler on the attack option, for example. So we can look up the chosen option by just finding the right index of our options array. And so that's going to be button.dataset.button. But we want to make sure that we're parsing it as a number and not a string. And now we have that option config figured out, we can go ahead and fire the handler. So now clicking this button will look up the right option in our list and then find that handler function and fire it. We'll fix this buttons here to be button because I can't talk and type at the same time. We can also add some other events here. Like when we mouse over the button or mouse enter it, we want to make sure that it gets focused. So we'll tell the browser to focus this element. And then when it does get focused, we can add a focus listener for it. We want to go ahead and update our previous focus internal state. And now when we do focus on a button, we can go ahead and update that description bar text. So we'll say this.description bar element text.inner text, because this is a paragraph tag we're talking about, is going to be the button data attribute for description. And that's what we're capturing right here. Now when I boot up the game and I hover over a button, it gets focused, which is great, and then you can see the bottom description updates too. So if I come over swap, change to another pizza, attack, change to another pizza, attack. I can click the button too, and if I pop open the console, you'll see the console logs that we put in that attack handler are firing. Now one little nice quality of life thing we're gonna do is go ahead and automatically focus that first button when we put it into the DOM. So we can come back up here to where we're assembling our DOM here for each element. And just like we did with disabled attribute, I'm gonna add another one called autofocus attribute. And that's gonna check if the index is 0, we wanna create this autofocus attribute. And then again, we'll just plop it right on that button tag. There's a little bit of an edge case here where if it's 0 and disabled, that we could be auto-focusing a disabled attribute button, and that would be bad, but we'll just ignore that edge case for now. Now let's go ahead and add our arrow bindings. So when we tap the up and down keys, we want to be changing which button is selected. So at the top of the file, we had started this dot up and this dot down is empty, is null. Now we can go ahead and fill them in. So we'll say this dot up is going to be a new key press listener using our helper that we created before a few videos ago. This is going to be listening for the arrow up key code. And then we'll do the same thing for down. And so we'll fill these out in a second, but first we want to make sure that everything gets cleaned up when we don't need this keyboard menu anymore. We want to make sure that these key listeners don't linger around. And so I'll make a new method here called end, and this should be called whenever we're done with the keyboard menu. This helper that we created includes an unbinder. And so for each up and down, we can run the unbind method, and that'll clean up the binding for us. While we're here, we need a way to get rid of the keyboard menu and description box elements on the screen, and so we can just do that in the end method as well. So whenever end is called, we're going to grab the element and the description element and remove them from the DOM. Okay, now for the fun part. What we want to do now is find our currently focused element and then focus the previous one if we're hitting the up arrow, or the next one if we're hitting the down arrow. Now I'm going to come at you with a little bit of tricky browser stuff, and because we're including this disabled feature, which is really great and worth it, it does add a little bit of complexity to what we're trying to do next. In short, if this button is focused, we want to scan the DOM and find the next button down, which is actually up a level and then down, but making sure that it's not disabled. Again, just like we talked about before, we really don't want to focus on a disabled element. We need to query for the next or previous button in a little bit of a fancier, more complicated way. So first I want to grab the number of the current button that's focused right now. So I'll say current is going to be a number. We're going to grab that previous focus and get the attribute data button. With this being a number, we can then search for similar elements that have that same value but as a greater number. So this will be nice and easy to compare. Now to find our next button, we want to take all of the buttons that we have on the screen that have data button on them, and specifically anything within our menu element here. It's going to give us a nice list of buttons. Then we want to find one, and we're looking for the one that has a data set greater than the one we're currently on. So greater than current, but then we also need to make sure that it's not disabled. And now if we found that button, we can go ahead and focus it. From here, our other events we have set up, like the focus listener, will take care of selecting that one in the DOM and updating the description text. Now let's repeat the same steps in the up handler, but with a little bit of a twist. So we'll find the current one just like we did before, and then we'll say const previous button. We're going to bring over the same array conversion and the search, but this time, of course, we want one that's less than our current value. But now really, it's likely that the first match, or definitely one of the earliest matches, is going to fit this criteria. And so we actually want to search the list in reverse. And so right before we do this find, we can go ahead and run the native reverse command on our array here. This way, if we're on option 5 and we're really looking for option 4, it's not going to match on option 0 or 1 or an earlier one before 4. It's going to start at the end of the list and then work down that way. And just like before, if we have a previous button, we'll go ahead and focus it. Let's see this working. When I'm in the browser here, I can hit up and down. Disabled options will automatically be skipped over, but I can select these with my arrows now. And if I hit enter on an option, it's going to automatically fire that handler callback, just as if I was clicking on the button. Now that all of this base work is in place, we can actually make this exciting. So let's go ahead and wire up these options to actually do things. So I'm back in submission menu.js now, and in here we've got a root page. That's what's showing on the screen now. I'm gonna start filling out this attacks page. Say I had an option here called my first attack, and a description, of course, and a handler. Now we want these types of options to dynamically come from our caster, like which attacks does my pizza know how to use. But for now, let's just get this on screen. So when we choose the attack option here, we want to switch to this page of options, the attacks page. So in the handler, I'll grab our keyboard menu, and we'll run that set options method. This time we're going to grab the attacks page here. So we'll say this.getPages.attacks. So when this handler fires, we're going to rerun this function, but grabbing the attacks page. Then we should see each attack that we know. And so the handler for these will be more like submit this move. Let's see this working. Now when I choose attack, you see that the list is refreshed with new options, my first attack. But now I'm stuck here, so let's add a back button so that I can easily get back to that first root menu. When we're assembling all the pages here in the get pages method, let's go ahead and start with a static back option. This can be reused in a few different cases, so we'll define it up here. The label's going to say go back. It's going to have a description saying go back to the previous page. It's always going to go back to this root page. So the handler is going to set options to the get pages, get the root. And now here in attacks, I can go ahead and use that as the second option. We can fill out items as well. And that can just start with the option, back option. We can even wire up our root options option to go to that items page. We'll undisable it. Now when I fire it up, you can see that when I click attack, I have this second go back option. When I click that, I'm back to the root. I've got items as well now. There's nothing in here yet, but there is a go back option, so I can do that. Now I'm never stuck. Now let's rework this attacks page to be dynamic so that we see a list of options of all the actions that a pizza knows. I'm going to come down to this part that we hard-coded a first attack, get rid of that. And what we're going to do is spread in our caster's actions. This is going to be an array of strings, and so we want to transform each of those strings into the action, into this format that we expect here. So we'll map the key. Say action is going to be, we'll look up the actual action model from our global set there, and then we'll return an object in the format we expect. So we'll have a label and a description and a handler. Add our comma here. So when this runs, we're going to have one nice flat list of options, starting with all the attacks and then the back option tacked on at the end there. The handler, we want to run a different method on the same class. And we're going to call it menu submit. And this is just going to take in the action that we want to submit. This is going to end up doing pretty much the same thing that decide is doing here to complete the battle event, passing through the decision that we made. So let's go ahead and define that. And it takes in an action. In the future, it's also going to take in something called an instance ID. When we get to items and inventory, each item is going to have a unique identifier on it to know like which item you actually used. We're also going to pass through an instance ID. But in this case, we're just going to default that to null. And so here, we'll go ahead and complete the overrolled event. In fact, we can copy over exactly what is happening in decide right now, clean up the action to be the same action that's passed in. We're going to make this dynamic in a second, but before we do that, we don't need this duplication exactly. This decide method can turn into the act of just deciding which move we should use and then passing that through to the menu submit. So we'll really just grab the action here, get rid of all this, and just call this .menu submit, passing in the action. Now in our menu submit here, if we have some of those keyboard event bindings lying around from creating the keyboard menu, now is the time that we want to end those. And that's why we set up that end method. So we'll grab our keyboard menu, and if we have it, there's a chance that we landed on this method without going through that path. We'll go ahead and call end on it. So now we're all set up to actually submit the action that we choose from the menu. Menu submit is being called here from the dynamic list of attacks, and we'll see that on screen in a second. Before we do though, let's clean up this part. Right now we're always assuming that the target should be the enemy, but if we're using one of those positive moves, we may want to target ourselves instead. Instead of just assuming enemy here, let's take a look at the action and see if the targeting type is friendly or not. So if the action target type is friendly, we can go ahead and use this .caster as the target, but otherwise we can default to enemy. In the previous video, we had a bit in battle event where we were doing that logic here, but now that we have the true submission menu ready to go, we can go ahead and remove this bit. So now target type friendly moves will automatically come through with the right target. And one more quick fix here. When we're iterating through our caster attacks in submission menu.js, we need to make sure that it's actions, not action. So let's see this working. Now when I choose attacks, I get a dynamic list of all the attacks I know and a go back option. The handler for these two options will go ahead and run that menu submit method. So I can go ahead and use olive oil and the flow continues like normal. And notice that the enemy combatant automatically used that decide method because they are not is player controlled. Let's add another attack to our player pizza. So in actions.js, let's grab this saucy status one and go over to our pizza decks, making sure that S0001 starts with this move too. So now this pizza knows how to do 3 different moves. When we reload now, attack shows all the moves. Tomato squeeze is target type friendly, and so this should be applied to us instead of the enemy. And it works. There is a quick bug that we introduced that we should address now. The autofocus bit works for this first root menu here, but as soon as you choose a different menu, that works because I hover it, but if I use the keyboard, you lose the focus. So we need to adjust our autofocusing code to work a little bit differently. Towards the top of keyboard menu, let's go ahead and rip out that autofocus bit, which remember has that edge case anyway, and so we can go ahead and just fix that right now. So we're not going to autofocus it there, but at the bottom, after we've created all the elements and then we've done all the bindings and stuff, we're just going to introduce just a tiny little delay, just real quick, like 10 milliseconds or so. And then we can find the first button that's not disabled and focus that one. And so we can use a little bit of a tricky DOM query, but here it is. Within our element, we're going to find any button that has data on it, but it should not be disabled. So if it doesn't have the disabled attribute, then we're good to focus it. And now the first active button will be focused, not necessarily just the first one. So back in the browser here, I can use the keyboard freely, and I always get that focus that happens. So I don't even have to touch the mouse. So now we have a menu system that is built into the game and ready to go. We can continue to reuse it as we make more menus on the game. We don't have to worry about clicks anymore or keyboard handlers because that's all abstracted away from us and built into the system. So from here, it's just us adding more things to the menus and adding more menus, period. Next, we're going to focus on filling out some of these item menus so that you actually have items that you can use on your pizza team, and then also swapping out which pizza is active if you want to switch to a different pizza. Those things and more are on the way. Thank you as always for watching this video to the end. If you haven't already, I really appreciate it when you hit the like button and subscribe for the whole series. If you're working on a game, come join our Discord. We got a great group of people in there that are working on and playing indie games. So if you want to come tell us about your project, we'd love to hear about it. Thank you so much. Catch you next time.